What a wild ride. Today, we take a look back at 2020. Hi there again, it's Jeff, and this is Plain English lesson number 324. JR is the producer, and the full lesson is available at plainenglish.com/324. Coming up today, I bet you forgot a lot of what happened in 2020. I sure did. Locusts, wildfires, Harry and Meghan, Brexit, the Diamond Princess, Parasite. It all happened in 2020, and we'll take a nostalgic spin through this crazy year. The expression is arms race. This is a long lesson, so let's dive right in. The year began innocently enough with news from London. Prince Harry and his wife, the Duchess of Sussex, would be stepping back from their royal duties to pursue a private life in North America. Britain officially left the European Union on January 31st, 2020, 3.5 years after its dramatic vote in 2016. The split was real, but not as disruptive as many had feared. The two sides left the hardest negotiating to later. In fact, the EU and Britain spent much of the year trying to negotiate an agreement that governs their trading relationship going forward. Their current agreement ends on December 31st. In other political news, Donald Trump had been impeached at the end of 2019 and was promptly acquitted by a friendly Senate in January. A mysterious disease started spreading in China, causing some fears that it might spread to other countries. International travelers arriving in Europe and the U.S. started wearing face masks as a precautionary measure, but most countries dismissed the possibility that it might turn serious. Australia began the year battling some of the worst wildfires in its history. By the time they were over in March, over 18 million hectares had burned, destroying almost 3,000 homes and causing billions of dollars in damage. 3 billion animals were injured or killed, and several species may have been driven to extinction. Tragedy struck in a much more personal way in California. Basketball star Kobe Bryant died in a plane crash in Los Angeles. His 13-year-old daughter was aboard the plane. They had been going to one of her basketball practices. The Diamond Princess cruise ship anchored offshore in Japan after an outbreak on board. Almost the entire ship had the new disease, and nobody knew what to do with the sick passengers. China had imposed dramatic restrictions on the city of Wuhan, the epicenter of the disease. Still, life continued as normal in most of the world in February. The Kansas City Chiefs won Super Bowl 54 in Miami. Parasite won Best Picture, the first non-English language movie to do so. Then, all hell broke loose in March. An outbreak in northern Italy overwhelmed hospitals. Nobody knew how to treat this disease, and the death rate was alarmingly high. It was spreading quickly and severely affecting the region's senior citizens. The Italian government took the unprecedented step of ordering citizens to stay at home unless they had specific permission to leave. Paralyzed, other governments around the world lost the opportunity to get out in front of the problem. Spain, France, and other countries in Western Europe followed in Italy's footsteps. their health systems overwhelmed by this new disease. The U.S. was first hit in Boston, then in New York, San Francisco, and quickly in other populated areas. Lockdowns, stay-at-home orders, and business closures followed, but seemed temporary. By April, it was clear that the lockdowns would be a new normal until a vaccine could be found. Sports, music venues, restaurants, bars, nightclubs, cinemas all closed. Then, in a domino effect, came daily necessities like hair salons, gyms, and shops. Only essential businesses stayed open. Europe and North America settled into business closures and restrictions for the long run. Latin America followed. And so began a forced experiment in long-term remote work and remote education. Many professionals found this to be easier than they thought it would be. But many service sector workers were furloughed or lost their jobs during the lockdowns and still haven't returned to full-time work. In the developing world, lockdowns hit especially hard as many workers were forced to stay home and didn't have the resources to provide for their families. In India, millions of city laborers without any chance to make a wage embarked on a massive reverse migration to their home villages, often traveling on foot for hundreds of miles. Global stock markets plummeted in March amid the uncertainty surrounding the virus and the response, but it was a short crisis. Markets in China and America both staged dramatic comebacks and set record highs before the year was over. In May, with nerves already frayed from the pandemic, an American police officer in Minneapolis, Minnesota, killed a black man on the street by kneeling on his neck for more than 8 minutes, an appalling instance of unjustified police brutality. Demonstrations erupted first in the United States and then around the world as protesters demanded reforms to policing and an end to racial discrimination. Several world leaders fell ill with COVID-19. Boris Johnson was hospitalized and put in intensive care. Donald Trump was hospitalized in the midst of his re-election campaign. Brazil's Jair Bolsonaro was also infected, as were leaders of Bolivia, Honduras, and Guatemala. Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau narrowly escaped. He self-quarantined after his wife caught COVID, but he never got it. In a scary moment, a health minister in Iran started showing symptoms of COVID-19 during a live television briefing about COVID-19. Royalty was not spared. Britain's Prince Charles and Prince Albert II of Monaco were infected. Tom Hanks, the closest thing we have to royalty in the United States, was one of the early victims too. The world's governments started a cycle of loosening, tightening, then loosening restrictions. Over the summer, it seemed that COVID was dying down, that we could manage it with mask wearing and social distancing, but the virus came back in force in the fall and many restrictions returned. France, Ireland, and the UK went into another strict lockdown. In London, they discovered a new strain of the virus that spreads 70% faster than previous strains. New York closed indoor dining again in December. Even sunny Los Angeles banned outdoor dining as well as the year came to a close. It was not a good year for democracy and personal liberty. China imposed a strict new law on Hong Kong, clamping down on speech and expression, all in the name of national security. Belarus and Venezuela cemented their slide into total dictatorship with sham elections. Poland, New Zealand, and the United States held legitimate national elections. Even Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern seemed surprised at the magnitude of her own victory in New Zealand. It was the best showing for a major party there since 1951. American Democrats' prayers were answered when Joe Biden toppled Donald Trump in November, though the final vote was closer than they had hoped it would be. Chile overwhelmingly voted to form a constitutional convention to draft a new constitution. Lebanon's entire cabinet resigned after a massive explosion in the port of Beirut that was caused, in part, by government negligence. Lebanon's parliament is still trying to form a replacement government. The president of France, now himself sick with COVID, is mediating. Giant hornets from Japan crossed the Pacific Ocean and attacked people on the west coast of America. A swarm of locusts chewed through much of East Africa's food supply. It was the worst locust infestation in 70 years in Kenya. After a year of bad news, hope emerged in November. Not only had 2 global pharmaceutical companies developed vaccines against the coronavirus, but the vaccines were shown to be 90% effective in preventing the disease, a much better result than had been anticipated. Several other vaccines in late-stage trials were also promising. 90-year-old Margaret Keenan of Coventry, England, was the first person to receive the newly approved Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine. Several new words entered our vocabulary, at least in English. Social distancing must be the phrase of the year. PPE, or personal protective equipment, was a buzzword. Lockdown, once used only in emergency situations, described our everyday existence. Super spreader, asymptomatic, droplets, incubation, flatten the curve, shelter in place, N95. The terminology of epidemics became the vocabulary of the masses in 2020. It was the year we learned to appreciate healthcare workers, supermarket employees, and delivery men. Italy set the example for the world at the beginning of the pandemic, saluting healthcare workers and keeping spirits up by singing on their balconies during the darkest moments of the early outbreak. For the world's middle class, 2020 was the year life slowed down. With global travel frozen and offices shut, people adapted to life indoors, video calls, takeout instead of indoor dining, wearing a mask in public, and working and studying from home. Global sports leagues restarted toward the end of the year, mostly without fans or with limited capacities. The pandemic struck just when new streaming platforms were in an arms race for content, providing the world a comfortable cushion of new television shows and movies for the lockdown. Traditional cinema wasn't so lucky. Most movie theaters remain closed, and blockbuster releases scheduled for 2020 either went straight to streaming or were postponed. Netflix said viewing time of documentaries and reality TV had doubled this year over prior years, and non-English content was up 50%. The most popular reality shows were Tiger King, Love is Blind, and Selling Sunset. In international content, The Platform from Spain, House of Flowers from Mexico, Barbarians from Germany, The Crown from the UK, and Rogue City from France were also popular. Korean dramas started to gain popularity too after Netflix signed up several of them. Home cooking shows were popular, and sourdough bread baking became a worldwide family tradition. More than your money's worth today, there was no way I could summarize 2020 in the length of a single average lesson. Can you believe we were talking about Harry and Meghan a year ago? It seems like a minimum of 3 years of global events in just 12 calendar months. Today's expression is arms race. In fact, I used this just a few weeks ago, too. Here is the traditional meaning of an arms race. Two enemy countries each want to build armies. Each one of the countries wants an army big enough to defeat the other country if necessary. One country builds a strong army. The other country matches it and goes just a little bit further to be stronger than the first. Well, the first one responds and buys more weapons or arms, looking to gain an edge. Not to be outdone, the second one also buys more weapons, and so they go back and forth, each increasing their armies, navies, air forces, and weapons stockpiles, each one trying to be a little stronger than the other. That's an arms race. They usually end with some kind of major disruption. The most famous arms race in modern history was between the United States and the Soviet Union during what's now called the Cold War. That was a nuclear arms race where each side continued to build their nuclear weapons stockpiles, never wanting to have fewer arms than the other side. Prior to that, arms races were common throughout European history, though with more traditional arms, more traditional weapons. Many arms races go to absurd limits. There would be no reason to continue building up arms except for the sake of competition. The US and Soviet Union each had enough nuclear weapons to destroy each other many times over. There was no point in continuing to stockpile weapons except to have more than the other side. The two sides pushed each other to absurd limits. I said an arms race ends with a disruption. In this case, it was only the collapse of the Soviet Union that put a stop to the nuclear arms race. Today, we use arms race to describe any competitive situation where two or more parties are each trying to outdo each other. This usually leads to an absurd outcome. A few weeks ago, I said that American retailers were in an arms race to open earlier and earlier on Black Friday and offer deeper and deeper discounts to shoppers. That means one store would open at 6 a.m., the others followed. The next year, a store would try to gain an edge and open at 5:30. A competitor would open at 5. A few years later, stores were opening at midnight. Then they opened the day before and stayed open all night. This is an arms race, each side wanting to gain an edge. They both push each other to absurd limits. Nobody really wanted to open at midnight, but they couldn't allow their competitors to gain an advantage either. The consumer backlash against opening so early and the advent of online shopping were the disruption that put a stop to this arms race. Now, there's an arms race to offer the earliest Black Friday discounts online. What was once a single day became a week, then a month. It now starts in October and goes through Christmas Eve. Perhaps in a few years, Black Friday itself will be the beginning of the next year's Black Friday discounts. That's the sort of thing that happens in an arms race. Just before COVID hit, major streaming platforms were in an arms race for content. Disney Plus, HBO Max, and Apple all wanted to get better movies and TV shows than the others. They were all taking aim at the industry leader, Netflix. Netflix started stockpiling new content too. Fine by me, that means everyone's competing to offer more and better entertainment options, and I can sit back on my couch and enjoy it all. I'll let those companies fight it out while I finish The Crown. For the men in the audience, question for you. How many blades does your razor have? Mine has 2. When I was in college, Gillette found out I had just turned 18 and they mailed me a free Mach 3 razor. It was a brand new shaving product and they were sending free samples to everyone just reaching shaving age. It was a handle and a replaceable cartridge of 3 blades each. They cost a fortune at the drugstore, but I was hooked. I used the Mach 3 for several years. Then, a revolutionary idea struck like a thunderbolt at competitor Schick. 4 blades. Mind blown. Schick introduced its 4-blade razor, clearly 33% superior to my old-fashioned Mach 3. Ladies and gentlemen, well, just gentlemen, we had an arms race. Gillette introduced its Fusion with, you guessed it, 5 blades. Men across America were pawing at their faces with enormous razors with 5 blades each, convinced by Gillette's massive marketing machine that this was necessary. Not to be outdone, Schick followed with a 5-blade razor of its own. Then Gillette redesigned the handle with a swiveling ball hinge, allowing the blades to pivot as you dragged them across your face. Then both companies put a battery in their razors so that they pulsed and vibrated as you shaved, blurring the lines between an electric and traditional razor. One introduced a heating mechanism so you could not only shave with 5 sharp blades, but they could vibrate, swivel, and heat up. The simple act of shaving in the morning turned into a carnival ride. With every new innovation, the cartridges got more expensive. This was madness. It was the definition of an arms race, first in the number of blades, then in useless features. Finally, mercifully, several direct-to-consumer companies disrupted the traditional shaving razor brands and offered high-quality blades at a reasonable price delivered to your door without the marketing gimmicks. The razor cartridges I use from Dollar Shave Club have just 2 blades on them, and believe me, they work just fine. What's more, they're delivered to my door once a month and cost way less than the Mach 3 cartridges from 20 years ago. The arms race in shaving razors has thankfully come to an end. Today's quote of the week is by Mick Jagger, the lead singer of the Rolling Stones. It's a great place to end 2020. Here's what he said: "The past is a great place, and I don't want to erase it or to regret it. But I don't want to be its prisoner either." As we look forward to 2021 and a post-COVID world, let's all take his advice and not be a prisoner to the past. And that is all for this very long lesson. We've got one more left in 2020, and that one is coming up on Thursday, New Year's Eve. On that lesson, I'll venture some guesses and predictions about what's to come in the world in 2021. Then we can all laugh about it in a year's time, right? Remember to join us then and to check out all the great lesson resources we have at plainenglish.com between now and then.